series of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Today we have a lecture by one of our junior fellows, Dr. Amit Suman, on the topic Colonial Experiments with Sanskrit Knowledge Tradition, a case study of Calcutta Sanskrit College. We know that in the initial days of the colonial conquest of India or parts of India in the late 18th century, in the 1770s, 1780s onwards, there was a lot of interest about India's indigenous learning traditions. There was a special interest in the Sanskritic learning tradition of India. It is from this base that Indology as a discipline developed, and study of this Sanskritic tradition also played a crucial role in the development of Orientalism as an ideology and as a subject matter of study. In the initial days of the British conquest of India, we can see that there was considerable appreciation and admiration, almost adulation at times, for Sanskrit as a language and for its learning tradition. This continued for a period of about half a century, we can say from 1770s to 1820s. During this period, a number of British officials, scholars such as Warren Hastings, William Jones, Colebrook, and many others, they contributed in an important way to the cultivation of Sanskritic knowledge. And what we notice about this period is that the later racist hubris, which became characteristic of the British in India from around the 1830s, was by and large missing in this period. Sanskrit was seen as one of the greatest languages of the world, and there was a lot of appreciation for the Sanskrit learning tradition. Of course, there were fractures within this appreciation, there were criticisms, but the overall orientation was definitely positive. And as the 18th century came to an end and the 19th century started progressing, and simultaneously the British power started getting consolidated in India, we see a movement towards a more negative opinion of Indian civilization as a whole and of Sanskrit learning tradition and of Sanskrit language as well. Now, this, of course, was epitomized by many things, but one very important milestone in this regard was the publication in 1817 of James Mill's History of India, in which he described India as a backward civilization which had never been a match of the European civilization, whereas earlier the Orientalists, the Indologists, had put the Indian civilization in antiquity more or less in the category of all other great civilizations of the world. So that shift, of course, had already taken place about the time of 1820. However, Sanskrit and Sanskrit learning tradition had not lost attraction entirely among the British bureaucracy and the intelligentsia in India. The foundation of this Sanskrit college in Calcutta basically happened at a very crucial juncture when this change from the old Indological Orientalist tradition to the utilitarian tradition, which became dominant in the 1830s and 40s, was happening. So, in that context, the foundation of the college becomes very, very important. And of course, there were many debates around, what the college should contain and what kind of syllabus it should have and who should head the college, etc., etc. So we are really delighted to have Dr. Amit Suman with us to throw further light on this subject. I welcome Dr. Amit Suman, and I welcome all participants who have joined us this afternoon. And now, without any further delay, I would like to request Dr. Amit Suman to proceed with his lecture. Thank you. Welcome.
Uh, Thank you so much, sir, for your kind and generous introduction about the subject. And you made my work very easy because you have very rightly put in all the details about the historiographical debate which was going around in the late 18th and early 19th century regarding the Sanskrit knowledge tradition, and also about how the Sanskrit college was formed. Uh, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank, because this is the final lecture of my tenure here. So I would like to start by thanking all the staff member of Teen Murti, including the former director Shri Shakti Sinha ji, Dr. Mishra, Dr. Shukla, Iqbal, and Rajneesh, for giving all kinds of support during my tenure as a junior fellow here. My topic, as Dr. Mishra has introduced, is called Colonial Experiments with Sanskrit Knowledge Tradition, a case study of Calcutta Sanskrit College. Uh, as he rightly said, that during the late 18th century, when colonial administration was getting power into the Indian soils after 1767, 1764 and 1765, it was one of the important juncture because uh, at one hand, Mughal rule in a way was continuing. At the same time, we were seeing the emergence of new British power in India. And also this led to a new development called not only in the field of administration, but also in the field of education from 1780s onward after the establishment of Calcutta Madrasa in India. So this before I start talking about in details about this Sanskrit College Calcutta, I would like to give a brief introduction about what kind of Sanskrit knowledge tradition we had before the colonial intervention. And initially, uh, coming out of colonial period led to the development of institutionalization of education in India. Before that, we had informal practices as well as formal practices, both in the forms of pathshalas and gurukuls, as well as individual and private charitable institutions, patronized by local zamindars and rajas and emperors. But all those institutions was largely based on the traditional bonding, traditional personal bonding of teacher pupil relationship. And those relationships were not only emotional but also practical, because teacher was the one person who was responsible for the overall growth of mind as well as social awareness of the student. And importance of guru, academic acumen was very important during those days, because there was no fixed syllabus, there was no fixed curriculum. So guru was supposed to be the best judge, and also we did not had any kind of examination system then. So guru was the best judge to find out whether their students are capable of going through a certain period of study, and also are they now empowered enough to leave that institution. So from moving to that informal setup to the formal one with the establishment of British Empire in India was a big juncture. And 18th century in itself, according to the historiography, was a period of continuity and change, where one set of practices was continuing, at the same time new set of practices were being introduced by colonial administration. So late 18th century and early 19th century, as rightly put out by Dr. Mishra, that it was also a period of debate between or conflict between Orientalists and English regarding the indigenous education. So we cannot ignore the exceptional merit of indigenous education, which has a long history of existence since the very beginning, especially in regard when we talk about Sanskrit education since the ancient period. So this paper is basically an attempt to look at developments related to the Sanskrit education in colonial period, and also highlights the utility of this education for indigenous stakeholders and the British administrators. And therefore, it is not necessary to go into the details of his past history. However, some of the present day problems of Sanskrit education have their roots deep in the past and cannot be properly understood without reference to the historical forces which brought them into existence. As for instance, there is the unique phenomena of the independent existence of indigenous system of Sanskrit education existing along with the Sanskrit teaching in modern school, colleges, and universities. There is no parallel in the Western countries where classical education is an integral part of university educations and has no separate existence outside the universities. The available records are very sketchy with regard to the character and extent of Sanskrit education at its existence at the time and advent of the British Empire in India. which spearheaded in generally the English education. In 1811, the government had promised to establish colleges for the advancement of Hindu literature in Nadia and Tirhut on the lines of Banaras Sanskrit College. However, the scheme failed and the government decided to redeem its promise by opening a Hindu Sanskrit college at Calcutta, modeled after one at Banaras. On 13th April 1822, the press contained this notice, which I am quoting: with the kind of support and financial aid of Honorable Company, a Sanskrit college surpassing any such place known before will be opened in Calcutta. With the object of studying and teaching the grammatical and other Shastras, only Brahmin boys of the age of 12 and over will be eligible for admission. The course of students included, in addition to the various grammatical system, instruction on Smriti, Alankar, Jyotish, Purana, Sankhya, Vedanta, etc. On, on these lines, on 1st January 1824, and some sources mention that February 1825 was the time when Calcutta Sanskrit College was established during the administration of William Pitt Amherst. Initially, Calcutta Sanskrit College was planned in 1817, but it was Raja Ram Mohan Roy who wrote a long letter to then Governor General saying that why do you want to teach us in our own languages, rather giving us education into your system, which was largely based on English education or European sciences. So he vehemently opposed that the opening of Sanskrit College in 1817, and it was the first kind of resistance which could see during the first half of 19th century by the Indian scholar or intellectual who has a long statures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who opposed the Sanskrit. Why to open a Sanskrit college or the Sanskrit based education, which we already have a long history of existence and we are well versed in that. If you seriously, the colonial government is seriously interested in educating us, why not to give education on the lines of European syllabus and curriculum? So that initiation of opening a Sanskrit college at Calcutta failed, and it led to establishment of another great institution called Hindu College, which is formerly known as Presidency College, and now it is existence in the name of Presidency University in Calcutta. So after the Raja Ram Mohan Roy's position, it was in a way postponed, but in 1823-24, during the time of Lord Ahmes in 1823, it was planned that again the Sanskrit college shall be introduced in Calcutta on the lines of Banaras and Nadia and Tirhut. So 1823, Lord Ahmes issued a letter, which I am quoting, which talks about the importance of this seminary and why colonial government wants to start this Sanskrit college here. When this seminary, I'm quoting Lord Ahmes' letter, when this seminary of learning was proposed, we understood that the government in England had ordered a considerable sum of money to be annually devoted to the instruction of its Indian subjects. We were filled with sanguine hopes that this sum would be laid out in employing European gentlemen of talent and education to instruct the natives of Indians in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences. We find that the government is establishing a Sanskrit college under Hindu Pandit to impart such knowledge as is already current in India. This seminary, which is similar in character to those which existed in Europe before the time of Lord Bacon, can be expected to load the minds of youth and with grammatical necessities and metaphysics, distinctions of little or no practical use to the processors or the society. The Sanskrit language so difficult that almost a lifetime is necessary for its acquisition. It is well known to have been for ages a lamented check to the diffusion of knowledge and the learning concealed under this almost impervious veil is far from sufficient to reward the labor of acquiring it, unquote. This letter was not Raja Ram Mohan Roy's letter was not successful because it does clearly state the points at issues between two parties, which was Indian scholars led by Raja Ram Mohan Roy and the government. Instead, Raja Ram Mohan Roy suggested that government should promote a more liberal and enlightened system of instruction, embarrassing mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences by employing men of talent and learning educated in Europe, and provide a college furnished with necessary books, instrument, and other apparatus. The original intention of opening of Calcutta Sanskrit College was to fulfill two functions. Firstly, to start an institution through which Sanskrit learning would be preserved in its entirety, and secondly, to educate persons qualified for certain appointments under the government, such as munsifs, principal sadar amins, and work in district adalats, for which a knowledge of Hindu law as embodied in Sanskrit language was deemed necessary. It has showed rigid adherence to tradition in its course of studies, its list of holidays, and it is proud exclusion of all castes except the Brahmins and some exception Vaidyas. Provisions were made for translating works on natural philosophy, geography, history into Bengali and other regional languages. The college during the start had a staff of 7 teachers on the day of opening, one each for Nyay, Smriti, Alankar, Kavya, and 3 for Vyakarna, which is grammar. The traditional nature of instruction provided needs no comment, but it should be noted that no provision was made for inclusion of English classes. Though such had been the intention of the government, English was introduced some 4 years later, but it was not received with enthusiasm and further became one of the focal points of contention between colonial administration and Indian intellectuals. The college building were intended to provide accommodation to the professors, students, beside lecture rooms, and an apartment for the reception of valuable philosophical apparatus presented by British Society to the Hindu College, but on the basis of an arrangement with the managers of that seminary, they were applied for both the institutions, which includes Sanskrit College, Calcutta. During its initial years, the college was started with 14 Pandits, a European secretary, and 100 students. Uh, Initially, European secretary was necessary to get funds from the colonial government, but further they relaxed this norm, and Babu Ram Kamal Sen was the first Indian secretary of Sanskrit Colleges, Calcutta, and he was invested with a duty to visit and have control over the institution, but not all kinds of control. Only he was supposed to manage the finances. Other things were managed by European administrators. And he was getting a monthly sum of rupees 100 as a fixed salary to his duties. The classes that constituted the ordinary course of study pursued in the college were 3 classes of grammar, 1 classes of general literature, 1 class of rhetoric and prosody, and 1 class of law and 1 for logic. These were the classes in association with the Sanskrit learning the students were supposed to get. And this was part of the daily routine of the students. The following departments were a part of initial establishment. Grammar department, which has 3 Pandits, Sahitya or literature department, which had 1 Pandit, Alankar or rhetoric department, which also had 1 Pandit, arithmetic and algebra department, again 1 Pandit, logic department 1 Pandit, law department 1 Pandit, medicine department 1 Pandit, and theology department 1 Pandit. At the Calcutta Sanskrit College, the number of scholars varied around 80 to 100 during the initial years of operation, out of which 5 students of Anglo-Indian College came to study Sanskrit. So those days, it was in today's world, we talk about interdisciplinary approach of institutions and students and courses. So those days also, people coming from Anglo-Indian College means Calcutta Madrasa. So initially Calcutta Madrasa was called Anglo-Mohammedan College and further Anglo-Indian College. So students from those institutions also came to Calcutta Sanskrit College, and the students of Calcutta Sanskrit College also used to visit to Calcutta Madrasa or other institution to gain expertise in different kinds of languages and literature of India. The pupils were divided into 2 categories. Into the classroom, they were divided into 2 categories on the basis of stipends, what kind of stipend they were getting. So first category belonged to the people getting stipend of rupees 5 to 8 a month, and their progress through the college and what kind of progress they were making through the course of study, which require at least 12 years, at least a period of 12 years of education. The second group consisted of free scholars who received no stipends during their course of study. The course of instruction pursued in the college was divided again into two branches. First branch meant to ensure a command over the language, which was Sanskrit, and the second included such branches of Hindu sciences as might have an object of the student to know, such as law, because law was one of the important subjects apart from Sanskrit to get good jobs into the British administration. Because if you know law along with Sanskrit, you were being hired into the district adalats and other different British establishments. Students were not eligible to attend college until they reached the age of 12 years at least. They were supposed to remain in the lower classes, in which their certain studies were prescribed for 6 years, after which they had a liberty to enter any class or classes and remain at their wishes for a further term of 6 years, provided their diligence did not relax. The dispatch of 1814, which is very important, emphasized that there were, I'm quoting, in the Sanskrit language, many excellent systems of ethics with code of laws and compendiums of duties, unquote. And the court of directors had therefore described that due encouragement should be given to the study of Sanskrit. In this report, in the report of Sanskrit College, Calcutta, which was published on 31st January 1835, Andrew Fraser, who was one of the important intellectuals of British administrator, who pointed regarding the feasibility of Sanskrit education in India. I'm quoting Fraser's argument that the acquisition of Sanskrit is indispensable not only for the study of classical books composed in the language, but principally as the mother tongue of a great number of Indian dialects. It is true and obvious that a true and radical reform of a nation in learning and morality, which is this object of the good government, will begin and proceed with improvement of their own national language. In this respect, the study of Sanskrit can be sufficiently encouraged, unquote. So this was the initial operation of Sanskrit College till 1830s, and after 1830s, especially 1835, when English Macaulay's Minute came, and which talked about, which had an objective that every institution who were getting funding from colonial government, they need to have English at least one of the important languages. Then only they'll be getting funded. So after that, operation, after that Macaulay's Minute, one of the important issues which took place was the conflict between who is more learned, whether the Pandits who were the in charge of Sanskrit College in Calcutta, or the Anglicist-minded British administrators who were getting all kinds of support from the colonial government after the introduction of Macaulay's Minute in India. So in that way, role of Pandits, who till now were very important not only into the spheres of Sanskrit education, but also into the overall development of students' mind and body and social awareness, their role in a way was being curtailed. So one of the important factors in the marginalization of Pandits in the early 19th century was simply the fact that colonial administrators began to routinely subject Pandits to their disciplinary metrics, not simply by retooling them to become judge Pandits, school masters, or headmasters, but also by reminding them that what their places are. Even when a Pandit rose to a position of greater respect and responsibility, such as when Ishwarchand Vidyasagar was appointed principal of Calcutta Sanskrit College, his status as a native meant that he necessarily remained a subaltern within the administrative system. Indeed, in 1853, Vidyasagar chafed at being forced to submit his policies at the Sanskrit College to scrutiny by James R. Valentine, his peer at the Banaras Sanskrit College, with whom he shared his rank. This was a condition he thought few educated Englishmen would be found to submit. It would seem that the political and social vicissitudes and economic distress which had come upon the Pandits as a class were not only reason for the rapid decline of Sanskrit studies in the latter part of 19th century, it was primarily the result of a change of outlook and attitude, fostered sedulously by a distinctly alien and somewhat haphazard state policy over a century, which was right in insisting upon modern learning, but which was certainly wrong in its comparative apathy towards ancient learning. There were never was any serious attempt to synthesize or correlate the two. In an excessive zeal of Western education after Macaulay's Minute, it was forgotten that the attitude was serving Hindu tradition and learning from the roots of Indian lives. It would not be just to deny that Western education had been of immense benefit. Without it would not have been out of date in an emerging advancing world. But during the same course of time, the colonial government did not attempt to adapt the old traditional Sanskrit learning to the changing social and political needs or the new learning to Indian sentiments and outlook. And that had their roots in the national consciousness and could not be summarily dismissed. And that it was never wise to replace it by Western education, however necessary and useful it might have been. The colonial government did not allow the traditional system either to die or to flourish, but by process of nominal assistance, retained it alongside of English education, it an unhealthy condition, ever subject to difficulty and were always open for criticism. As earlier said, that only Brahmins and Vaidya caste was associated with the Sanskrit education because they were also the experts of medicine, and when medical department was opened at Sanskrit College Calcutta, Vaidyas got some kind of more recognition into the Sanskrit structure. The peoples were expected to be able to read a little Sanskrit grammar when admitted, and during the course of 6 years, they were allowed to progress through the grammar, Sahitya, and Alankar classes. After 5 years, the students were required to attend arithmetic and natural philosophy classes on alternate days for at least 2 hours a day. If an English class was available, the students were expected to enter it as soon as they were admitted into the college. A further period of 6 years was permitted to complete the course of instruction, during which they were free to attend the classes of their liking. Law was the most sought after course. The English Department of College was established in 1827. It was again abolished in 1835 by the orders of General Committee of Public Instruction, but again it was re-established in October 1842 by the orders of Council of Education. This all was happening in 1830s because of the Macaulay Minute, and also during the same course of time, William Adams' report on indigenous education, based on Bihar and Bengal experiment, where he surveyed 1 lakh schools of Bihar and Bengal. So in a way, English Orientalist controversy was at peak in the 1830s of necessary oblique unnecessary changes. The college also successfully implemented the study of mathematics, the English language and anatomy, which was based on European principles, but taught at considerable numbers and with encouraging results. In the words of H.S. Wilson, who again was a famous British administrator, an inspector of school who examined the medical class, which was one of the sought after courses of Calcutta Sanskrit College in 1840s, I'm quoting him, the triumph gained over native prejudices is nowhere more remarkable than in this class, in which not only are the bones of human skeletons handed over without reluctance, but in some instances, dissection of soft parts of animals are performed by the students themselves. Admission conformity with the views of the government and was mostly liberally granted to all boys qualified by some knowledge of Bengali letters. This criterion scarcely excluded any quoted to. The scholarship was based on combination of factors including the level of individual's poverty as well as his diligence of proficiency in studies. However, by 1858, there were suggestions to abolish the Calcutta Sanskrit College and other Oriental institutions, and this was one of the main concerns of colonial government. During the same course of time, 1857-58, when the 1857 mutiny was taking place, That time, almost all the indigenous educational institutions established by Britishers in general, like Calcutta Madrasa or the Calcutta Sanskrit College, they all those institutions were converted into a barracks for the army, British Army, and studies in those institutions were almost at close for almost say 4 or 5 years. During the same course of time, a school inspector in Bengal called E. Roar saw that the Sanskrit college as a medieval institution. So in the same course of time, they were giving all kinds of negative argument about these kind of indigenous educational institutions, which was finding it hard to, and these institutions, according to them, was finding hard to keep up with the pace of requirements of modern education system. According to Roar, scientific study could not be achieved by Sanskrit college because it was based on stagnant Hindu sciences, which were by far outdated. Therefore, instead of a professorship at Calcutta University was suggested that would make use of Sanskrit in connection to the modern Western science, and some part of these letters are discussed vehemently and opposed vehemently by the Indian intellectuals. 1857 was again the same period when university education was started in India, and universities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras was opened. So they were talking about that all kinds of indigenous educational institutions started by Britishers shall in a way shall be closed because they all are continuing with the medieval kind of structure, and instead of that, professorship shall be created in the university system based on those languages and literature of India. One important event took place during the same course of time when Pandit Ishwarchand Vidyasagar, who was the principal of Calcutta Sanskrit College for a very long duration, addresses to F.J. Halliday, member of Council of Education, and also to the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal in February-March 1858, has been referred as the notes on the vernacular education. This is very famous address of Vidyasagar. In this, Vidyasagar has recorded his view on the subject of vernacular education, which in his opinion was highly desirable on an extensive scale and on an efficient footing. Vidyasagar also advocated that the vernacular institution of indigenous learning should do away with only giving instruction in 3 Rs, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic, and instead other subjects such as history, geography, biography, geometry, natural and moral philosophy, political economy, and physiology should also be taught to the Indians in the vernacular institution. He also advocated that the Sanskrit College, besides being a seat of general education, would function as a normal school for training of the vernacular teachers. Vidyasagar again emphasized on the role of superintendents and stated that by introducing the new class books and instruction giving to Guru Mahasaya, who were the teachers of village Pathshalas, about the mode of teaching, they would be able to turn the worthless Pathshala into an useful institution. So, the report of March 1859 by the principal of Sanskrit College is an indicative of growing number of students and classes in the college. However, the principal bemoaned the shortage of space for conducting classes as the military department took away the building that it owed. Apart from the remarkable and consistent Sanskrit scholars from the college, the study of English had also gained progress. However, there was still a need to raise the standard of English language. The principal introduced the study of English for an hourly basis as part of curriculum, because inter-translation between Sanskrit and English would enable the students to be well-versed with Western philosophy and bring them in touch with their reality, with an old philosophy based on myths and fictions would not attain. And also this would give students a chance to earn livelihood based on the translation works. One important event of 1859, which is very important according to my research, is a minute by W.H. Woodrow. He proposed some changes into the Sanskrit College. The letter dated 14th March 1859 states that by 1858, the concern of the college on a different issues were expressed by Principal Ishwarchand Vidyasagar, who suggested the adoption of methods that would raise the standard of Sanskrit College at par with other English institutions in Bengal, especially with regard to discipline and curriculum. According to him, for the attainment of this goal, the same principal that had been introduced in other English institutions should be immediately adopted. The following minute is indicative of how the native Indian teachers were by now considered fit to give instruction not only in Sanskrit but also in English language. This minute is also indicative of inability of the study of English language, as was suggested by the need to increase the staff in the English department, and how the Sanskrit college was unable to keep pace with the requirements of modern education. So again, a debate between modern and medieval kind of education was unnecessary, was bringing some kind of differentiation between Indian intellectuals and British administration. So what happened after this was uh, this led to a change in the curriculum and syllabi of Calcutta Sanskrit College in general and Sanskrit education in particular. So when we trace the history of Calcutta Sanskrit College, a same utilitarian approach was followed by British. They funded this institution initially to encourage the vernacular languages, which was basically regarded as Sanskrit in connection with the English language, so that the translation of important literally European works into Sanskrit could be carried out. However, gradually there was the section of Council of Public Instruction that spoke about futility of continuing with these uh, quote unquote medieval institutions of instruction, which they said should be replaced by modern Western institution. The British were convinced that this kind of traditional knowledge imparted in Sanskrit college could produce nothing but a section of pandits. In Europe, men having proper knowledge of vernacular language, but on contrary, there is a small incident. Uh, People who got educated at say centers of Banaras or Sanskrit centers of Calcutta, they were getting high profile jobs in Europe. But people who got educated here, they were not getting sufficient job opportunities in India beyond the level of clerk or maybe the Diwani Adalat kind of job. So one important incident which comes to my mind, that H.H. Wilson, who was closely associated with Banaras Sanskrit College since the time of 1810 to 1810 or 1812, when he applied to become a Bowdoin professor at England, there was a ground that if you have some kind of Sanskrit knowledge, uh, which you gained at your stint at Banaras College, and also if you learn good Sanskrit education from the learned men like Pandits of Banaras or say Calcutta, then only you are eligible for applying for that post. So when he applies at Bowdoin professor on the grounds that he has learned Sanskrit from the eminent Pandits of the city of Banaras and afforded valuable opportunities of improving his knowledge of Sanskrit. The European relied upon the Pandits to gain access to Sanskrit manuscript and to explain the cultural significance of Sanskrit literature, as well as to naturalize Oriental research into the Indian socio-cultural context. Wilson hoped that his Orientalist works would form part of European revival of Sanskrit literature on behalf of Indians, and Max Muller justified the translation of Vedas on the grounds that it would enhance Europeans' understanding of their own ancient Indian heritage. By the end of 19th century, 19 we see less number of students are being associated with the Sanskrit college, and the general decay of Sanskrit college character was started to take place. So at the end of 19th century, we see that there were only 19 students who were enrolled in the arts classes, out of which Sanskrit was taught to a much higher standard than the university required. Another 25 students were studying for the title examination, and five of them are acquiring MA degrees in Sanskrit. The college, under the charge of Mahopadhyay Mahesh Chandra Nyay Ratna, was maintained at a cost including 21,458, of which 105 were collected through fees. The Sanskrit title examination, which was held in 1885-86, were conducted by a board of examiners comprising partly of professors of college and learned pandits from the places in Bengal, and this examination 72 students passed in various branches of literature, law and philosophy, and received title corresponding to their achievements. So by then Sanskrit college also underwent many changes, and 1860s and 70s was the period when some kind of textbook discourse was happening. What would be the uh, medium of instruction would be carried out either in vernacular languages or in English languages or in the classical languages. So the 1860s and 70s or 80s was a period when the colonial administration as well as students and teachers were confused what kind of medium of instruction shall be carried out. But after that, it was decided by the colonial government that in vernacular school, vernacular medium was being introduced. In English school, English medium was introduced. And in the Oriental institutions like
Amit,
Calcutta Mothers.
if I may interrupt you,
Ji.
please start concluding now.
Okay, sir.
Yes.
So this was a general, observation about the Calcutta Sanskrit College, and uh, though it's a very long paper and Saraj requested me to conclude now. So there is a growing. So to conclude, I would like to say that the Muslims and Hindus' experiences of indigenous education differ from each other, despite the fact that both their religious essentially had one basic requirement. In this basis different, this hold the key to understand the course of changes that Sanskrit College of Calcutta had to go through in 19th century. For British officials, the Brahmin community could serve as an easy tool to educate and subsequently turn into future teachers of English, the European branches of science, mathematics, morals, and so on. However, for the Pandits of Calcutta, very few learning modern knowledge was of little or no use. The result of such an attitude is reflected in the low enrollment numbers in the foundation days of Sanskrit College. It is important to mention here that the interest picked up gradually and so did its popularity. Towards latter part of 19th century, however, the economic relevance of English in Bengal and direct and prolonged involvement of Pandits in assisting their colonial masters had made an average Bengali Pandit also aware of benefit of learning English. It was for this reason that enrollment in Sanskrit College, Banaras and Calcutta saw some students getting good jobs, and establishment of Calcutta Sanskrit College was an instant hit and did not witness the struggle that Banaras College had to face. This entire phenomenon highlights the fact that though Kashi and Kashi or Banaras were known as an important center of learning, the larger part of this popularity was restricted to religious knowledge and was under the purview of Brahmins and only registered communities who were supposed to get a good job as lawyers in the colonial legal system. The Sanskrit College was a key agent in the process of change that was visualized by the British. Sanskrit has to be understood in many ways, literally as a language through which the written form is communicated, metaphorically as a language and a code, discourse, and a cultural system, and something that is both reflective of social structure as well as ideology. Sanskrit College initiated change in those areas. This was done by improving the method of scholarship in language as well as introducing historical methods by Western treatises as model and carefully directing the studies through European professors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amit, for your very comprehensive and interesting lecture um, on this subject. And before I ask my own questions, I would like to request the participants to come up with their questions and comments. Yes, Mr. Sirajuddin, go ahead. Mr. Sirajuddin, please ask your question. Can you hear me? Mr. Sirajuddin.
Sir, he has written his question in the comment.
Yes, please go ahead. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Can't hear you. We can't hear you. Anyone else? Can't hear you. Iqbal? Iqbal. Iqbal,
Sir.
just tell Mr. Sirajuddin we can't hear him.
Okay, sir, I'm calling.
Any other question in the meantime? In the meantime, if there is any other question, please go ahead.
I think, sir, you start and then people shall follow you.
Okay, okay, we'll do that. Uh, uh, Amit,
Ji, sir.
as I said, you have presented a very interesting paper on this subject. One aspect of it on which I would like to get your opinion is, as I said at the beginning, that there were primarily two phases through which the European or the British assessment of Sanskrit as a language and of Sanskrit learning tradition passed. One was the initial phase of about half a century, when Sanskrit was accepted as one of the greatest languages of the world, and the Sanskrit learning tradition, and by conjunction, the Brahmanical learning tradition was looked upon with admiration. And then from the 1820s and 30s, as gradually the movement took place towards utilitarianism and Anglicism, in the period of Macaulay, for example, gradually the British rule in India developed the opinion that the Indian civilization was backward, and therefore, by definition, Indian languages, Indian literature, we know the infamous remark of Macaulay in which he said that one good book of European, uh, one good shelf of European books is equal to the literature, whole literature of India and
Yeah.
Arabia. So that opinion became the dominant opinion by the 1830s and 40s. Now, the important question, of course, is that Sanskrit was seen by the British from an early period, from the late 18th century, as the hegemonic presence in the Indian classical tradition. Now, you might know that in the initial period when the Christian missionaries were making their attempts to convert people in India, they in fact focused on the Brahmins, and they learned Sanskrit also quite assiduously, because their expectation was that if they are able to learn Sanskrit, understand the Sanskritic tradition, and convert the Brahmins, probably the rest of the Hindu society or the Indian society will be easy to convert. It is in this context that when we analyze this movement from Sanskrit being seen as a great classical language and the Sanskrit learning tradition, even if it was partly misunderstood, being seen as one of the great learning traditions, to the movement in 1830s and 40s, when the British started thinking that India is a backward civilization, and concomitant to that, the fact that their victory in India is well deserved, because the Indian people are a child people. They are not mature enough. They are not civilized enough. They are not advanced enough to rule over themselves. So, what was the connection between their attempt to hegemonize the Sanskrit learning tradition by creating institutions and by creating a discourse which would enable them to do so on the one hand, and the functional requirements of the British Empire as they had developed by the 1830s, when they had more or less completed the conquest of India? Of course, 1857 was yet to happen, which you have innocently described as mutiny. So probably it's just a slip of tongue. But you understand that by the 1830s or 40s, the conquest of India was more or less over. Of course, it had to be sealed by the British crushing of the revolt of 1857. So, what was, that connection between the functional requirements of the British Empire and the hegemonic discourse that they created about the Sanskrit learning tradition? This is the main question. Related to, of course, this is another very small issue which you have raised about the relation between Sanskrit learning and employment. Now, this, of course, is a very tricky question. In the modern world, learning is usually associated with employment and economic benefit. But was this really so in the Indian knowledge tradition? I doubt that. In the Indian knowledge tradition, by and large, knowledge of this kind, certainly Sanskritic learning, was pursued mostly by people for its own sake, irrespective of the economic benefit that it will bring. Therefore, quite naturally, when in the 19th century, when Sanskrit College was opened and when other institutions started promoting Sanskrit with an objective of kind of taking to some gainful economic employment, it became a problematic situation. It continues to be problematic to this day. How to build a bridge between India's classical learning tradition and economic benefit or employment remains a question even now. What are your comments?
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for raising two valid and very important questions, which is largely related to my studies. Uh, but I would like to first clarify that it was not slip of tongue raising mutiny, because I was quoting W. Wilson, and Wilson was said this. So I did not quote said mutiny. It was Wilson who was saying it.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the whole
Yeah.
statement.
Second thing regarding the Indian knowledge tradition and the issue of employment. Since the very beginning, since ancient period, Indian knowledge tradition was not thriving on to only one sphere of knowledge. There were parallel system of knowledge tradition was going on, whereas one set of learning which was largely dominated by Sanskrit learning, where only the who's who were supposed to got educated, was related to gaining some kind of knowledge or some kind of pleasure. But at the same time, one more aspect of learning which carried through the same period since the very beginning was the knowledge tradition related to practical training, or the practical subjects like art of maintaining zamindari, land
No, no,
records, and
Amit, that was definitely there. I'm by no means trying to suggest that Sanskritic learning tradition was the only learning tradition, by the way. It's just that I'm trying to say that the British saw the Sanskrit knowledge tradition as the hegemonic learning tradition, as the classical Indian tradition, and therefore they tried to negotiate with it and tried to bring it under their hegemony. So I'm not by any means questioning that there were other learning traditions.
yes, all right. So, regarding the first question which you raised about the colonial mindset during the initial years of operation and then during 1830s and 40s, but if we need to understand the larger picture, we need to understand that the initial part of British administration in India, which was confined say up to 1857, and after 1857, whole lot of 19th century can be understood into three phases. One phase which will start with the start of 19th century, and especially the role of 1813 Charter Act, which you also mentioned about the role of Christian missionaries getting all kinds of rights and benefit to transform or convert Indian masses in general into the Christianity. And 1813 Charter Act gave certain kind of privileged right to Christian missionaries to impart their education establishment, and also to have, in a way, informally conversion into the Indian thing. Uh, I have, I don't believe that only they were only focusing onto the Brahminical thing. Brahmins were used to, obviously, Brahmins had a hegemony over the Indian learning tradition, especially Sanskrit learning tradition. So Brahmins were used as intermediaries between the larger masses and the British administration to gain control over the larger masses. That is why the famous, theory of downward filtration theory of colonial administration, which talks about if we need to educate the Indians, we only are supposed to or responsible to educate the upper strata of society, which is Brahmins and obviously Maulavis, of Pandits and Maulavis, and those Pandits and Maulavis are supposed to give education to the lower strata of people. So Brahmins obviously were one of the important had a hegemonic presence into the 19th century educational spheres. But it was not in the, and also coming off of English education, which you rightly mentioned that English education brings a kind of debate between classical versus Anglicist, and also what kind of language and what kind of literature in the Indian education system should have. But after that period, see, because 1830s is not only the period which shall we remember only about the Macaulay's Minute, but also at the same time, colonial administration was responsible for bringing out one of the important, three important documents on the status of indigenous education in India by William Adams. And those documents talks about the basic nuances and importance of that knowledge tradition, which has a long history of existence, and it is in the strongest presence of Indian indigenous education system into the Bengal presidency, especially. So, latter part of 19th century, obviously, which you said that the role of Sanskrit education or the Pandits were changing, obviously changing because university one set of practice university education has come up, and also 1830s Macaulay's frame of English education that did not get support either from half set of British administrators also. Forget about Indian intellectuals or the intermediaries, because just surpassing that period, 1842 saw a Thomson experiments in Bengal, where it was planned that English education institutions shall vehemently replace the indigenous education institutions. But those practices for almost 10-15 years carried out in Bengal was failed drastically. And after the 1857 revolt, it was almost say Indian British government was in a way they were curious what kind of educational practices should we have, and then came the Kempson's practices in northwestern provinces, which says that the language is one of the important barriers which shall be taken care of. If we need to educate Hindus, we are supposed to educate them not only in Sanskrit studies but also in the vernacular language, say Awadhi in Awadh or Bengali in Bengal. And also English education, shall we say English as a subject shall be part of those institutions if you want to have certain kind of support from British administration. But English as a dominant language shall not be part of indigenous practices. So English education along with the indigenous education shall continue to grow in India, but vernacular languages and literature shall be one of the important part of or the medium of instruction.
All right, thank you. Any other question?
Am I audible? Can I ask a question? Small question.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
very
Go
much
ahead.
audible.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Suman, for your vivid description of a particular college in Kolkata. I happen to be a student of anthropology, and then it is very much known that I happen to work on a particular aspect of prehistorical period on a particular subject called the prohibition of beef among Hindus, and then prohibition of pork among Muslims. In connection with this, I happen to read a lot about the prehistoric uh, literature regarding this thing. And in this connection, I happen to go through the Max Muller's work, particularly on this Upanishads and Vedas. As you also mentioned, that he has come to India as an Indologist, and he has studied Sanskrit, and he has translated these things. What my particular question is, in what way you have most of your lecture has been concentrating on vis-a-vis Sanskrit versus English, but whereas he also translated it into the German language. This is my particular point. I would like to know that because of his coming to India, he has also expressed his opinion that India is a paradise on earth. It is like a paradise. India is a paradise. And then he also suggested that it requires a little bit of a what do you call some revolutionary, some kind of a modification as per the modern era. So my specific question is, he because of his coming, this due to this Sanskrit language, Vedic literature, he has translated it, and it has come to the limelight to the whole world outside. In this way, whether what is vis-a-vis Sanskrit language with reference to the German, or particularly with reference to this college, did he happen to visit this particular college there, and he had any kind of encounters there? This is one point I would like to know from you. And what about the Sanskrit versus vis-a-vis not only with English and German, plus also with this Dravidian languages, particularly one of the oldest Tamil language, Did you have any kind of, in your research study, did you encounter any kind of this kind of literature? I would like to know from you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your very good point talking about Max Muller's visit to India. Unfortunately, according to my research and archival files, whatever I have consulted, or and the vernacular sources, I don't find any mention about Max Muller visiting to any of the institutions of India, especially Sanskrit College, Calcutta, which was the main area of my research. Regarding the second thing, Dravidian, also I did not find any records related to my research because I belong to North India and my study was largely based on Bengal presidency. But regarding your overall observation, I think Dr. Mishra would be the right person to answer your queries because he also has a great interest in this kind of research what you are talking about. Sir, you may be the right person to answer his queries.
Unfortunately, I could not hear him. What has he asked?
He was asking
No.
about Max Muller's. Yes, sir, please
Yeah.
repeat your question.
Yeah, I was just wondering because it's Calcutta, particularly Bengal as such, is a land of economic renaissance, and then it has contributed a lot not only in terms of knowledge and in terms of independent spirit and so many aspects of it. So what I was asking Mr. Suman is the contribution of Max Muller vis-a-vis Sanskrit language and with English, and then whether he had any encounter with this college with which he has done a lot of research. And then I was just wanted to know about it, in what way his contribution has improved the Sanskrit knowledge through his translation of this Vedic literature to the outside world. This is what I was just asking.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you have asked a very valid question, but I'm afraid it falls outside the scope of Amit's lecture. So that's
he
why
will be
he's
the
not
right
venturing
person to-
out. So he has passed on the ball to me, and I'm ready to take it. See, I mean, there is
Maybe if it is not the case right now, maybe whenever I come
No,
to
no,
an
no,
end,
no.
I can
That's
discuss
all right.
about it.
You see, we can say that the fact of the matter is that Max Muller was undoubtedly the most important Orientalist, the most important Indologist produced by the Western world. Certainly in the 19th century and maybe even till now, there is absolutely no doubt about it. And he dedicated his entire life to the understanding of India's knowledge tradition. But it is not India's knowledge tradition alone. If you look at the Sacred Books of the East series, which he published, I think that out of the 50 volumes, about 25 to 30 are the books from India. And then there are books from Zoroastrians, from the Chinese civilization, and from others. So he was basically trying to understand the other of the Occident. That is to, he was trying to understand the East as a whole. And there, of course, his focus was certainly on India's knowledge tradition. He was the most important figure as far as this is concerned. Now, as Amit has already said, that he has not found any documented evidence of Max Muller visiting this Calcutta college, because probably Max Muller never visited India in the first place. And therefore, the question of visiting Calcutta college would obviously not arise. However, that does not take away from his contribution of translating and making India's learning tradition available to a large number of people around the world. Of course, there are many points of criticism about the work done by Max Muller, certainly, and it is not about Max Muller alone. In fact, I have already hinted at it, that the entire Western effort to understand India's knowledge tradition, especially the Sanskritic learning tradition, was a part of their attempt at colonizing Indian civilization. And this is not a point that I have made. This is a point that great scholars, for example, Bernard Cohn, Colonialism and Its Forms of Knowledge, in his classic book, he has talked about it. So scholars have worked on this subject, and I think that this is a very important opinion that we must debate about, as to how much of the Western interest in India's learning tradition was motivated by pure pursuit of knowledge, and how much of it was mediated by a desire to hegemonize the Indian society and civilization. how much of it was an attempt to basically see the Indian civilization, Indian learning tradition from the European lenses, and then try to categorize it, classify it, pigeonhole it, etc., etc. All these questions are certainly open to us. I personally would not like to see the Western attempts at understanding India's learning tradition as some form of conspiracy. Certainly not. But there is a deep connection between colonialism and the knowledge created by it, because the functional requirements of colonialism cannot be separated from the ideological output of colonialism. So in that sense, I will say that the output of of the European intellectuals, and the administrators and others should certainly not be separated from the fact of colonialism, from the fact that they dominated the third world, they dominated India. Certainly there is a deep connection, but what that connection is has to be seen on a case by case basis and in a general manner, without necessarily falling for a conspiracy theory. And the third part of your question, which you asked about whether he has done anything about Tamil. You see, Tamil entered this picture much later, obviously. They started with Sanskrit for many reasons, because in their eyes, Sanskrit had acquired that aura of being one of the greatest languages of the world. And also because Sanskrit was an Indo-European language. In fact, William Jones initially believed that probably it was the oldest Indo-European language, older than Greek and Latin. So they had a special place for Sanskrit, there is no doubt about it. And then Sanskrit learning tradition was, of course, very vast, and the number of texts that were available in the Sanskrit knowledge tradition was also very, very large. And also the fact that they were starting all this from Bengal, which had been a big center of Sanskrit learning from a very early period. In the medieval era, for example, Sanskrit learning was very important in many places in Bengal. Navyadip, for example, was a big center of Navya Nyaya there, and it produced such luminaries. I mean, so there is no, and in the 18th century itself, Jagannath Targupanchanan, who was a scholar of logic, and many other people, they were there in Bengal. So it's quite understandable that the focus of the European scholars and administrators would be initially on the Sanskrit learning tradition, and it was only later on, when they wanted to create a rift between the north and the south, that they shifted to the Dravidian tradition. And in fact, they were the first, if I can say so, to use the word Dravidian in the sense of a race or an ethnicity. Before that, it was used only for the geography of some parts of South India. So this happened around the middle of the 19th century. I think Bishop Heber was one of those who used this, categorization of the people of South India as Dravidians, and then this entire, entire idea of Dravidians and Indo-Aryans being two completely separate language groups in India. I started, and many other things happened. We all know the history of it. This is not the time to go into it. But anyway, thanks for your very interesting question that you have asked. And I think now we have reached the end of today's program. So I'm very, very thankful to Dr. Amit Suman for giving this interesting lecture on the Sanskrit College, Calcutta. And I'm thankful to all participants who have taken time off this afternoon to be present here. I solicit their continued presence in our other programs also. I think next week we have another talk. I don't have the details with me, but so far as I remember,
Suparna Sengupta will be speaking.
pardon?
Suparna
Sengupta. Next week we have another talk by one of our junior fellows, Dr. Suparna Sengupta. Do join us for that talk next week. Till then, goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.